settle down now. Hello, travelers. This is Professor Black. Welcome to Invokation Akademy's TCG 101 series, where we'll learn various TCG concepts through easy-to-understand 10-minute lessons. Our goal is to turn you from a third-rate duelist with a fourth-rate deck into a genius invocation champion. In today's lesson, we'll go over 3 common TCG deck archetypes and how they can be applied to Genius Invocation. For those unfamiliar with the term, an archetype refers to a group of decks that share the same playstyle and often overlap a lot on cards and characters as well. Now at first this seems like a lot of unnecessary labeling, but what makes this concept so useful is that you'll be able to quickly look at a new deck list and immediately have an understanding on how best to play that deck based on what archetype it falls into. It will also help when building your own decks, as certain cards, characters, reactions shine in specific archetypes and work better together. Understanding them will allow you to bring out the full potential in your favorite character even if they aren't meta. The 3 archetypes we'll cover are going to be aggressive or aggro decks, control, or more commonly in Genius Invocation called stall decks, and finally combo decks. So let's dive right in and start talking about the most straightforward of these, aggro decks. The goal of an aggro deck is to end the game as quickly as possible, and for Genius Invocation this typically means by about round 3. This archetype is most famous for decks that have a first turn kill or FTK potential. Even if these decks don't get to actually perform the FTK, the threat of that possibility can often force you to make suboptimal plays. And these decks are great at punishing players who spend too many dice at the start of the game, maybe equipping expensive weapons or artifacts or investing in ramp cards. These decks really like cards that buff damage against the active character. Pyro-Resonance is one of the best cards for doing this, giving you 3 damage for the cost of a single dice. Pyro-based reactions like Melt, Vaporize, and Overload are also perfect for doing this as well. And the combination of Pyro-Resonance plus a Vaporize, Melt, or Overload and a 3 damage skill already add up to 8 damage to the active character, which is huge. Because of this, most aggro decks you'll see will be based around Pyro and its reactions. However, Quicken is another reaction that is great at dealing damage to the active character and can also fall into the aggro archetype. For the same reason, damage buffing cards like Heavy Strike, Tandoori Chicken, and Adeptus Temptation are all cards you'll commonly find in aggro decks. And to enable those first turn kills more consistently, dice generation and cost reduction effects are also very important for these decks. Most first turn kills will require you to spend at least 9 dice worth of actions in order to execute, which means, given you only roll 8 dice in the first round, you'll need to find an extra die somewhere. A card like Changing Shifts is great for this, as a swap is always involved in order to trigger reaction. These decks also commonly have Resonance and have access to Woven as well, and sometimes more niche effects like Northern Smoked Chicken can be used depending on what characters you're using. A perfect example of the aggro archetype is the Mona Klee deck. This deck has a very easy to execute and consistent first turn kill with Mona skill, into Klee skill, charge attack, with a Mona summon at end of turn for a total of 11 damage for only 9 dice. Next, all the way on the other end of the spectrum, we have stall decks. Their goal is completely opposite to aggro, to prolong the game as long as possible and build up value by playing cards that gain dice advantage over time, either by healing or stopping damage with shields, or just by generating raw dice every turn. These decks tend to be the hardest to play, as they tend to be a little bit more reactive and rely on you knowing how to play based on what your opponent is doing. Healing and other defensive effects are a must in these decks. Hydro and Geo Resonance in particular are both incredibly efficient defensive options, and most decks will use one or the other. Unsurprisingly, Crystallize is the main reaction to use here since it generates shields, though sometimes stall decks can also be built around the freeze reaction. Tenacity of the Millelith is the most important card for this archetype, as it does everything that a stall deck wants. It generates shields, allowing you to prolong the game and gain value, and also gives you extra dice while doing so. You can supplement this as well with additional healing cards like Favonius Cathedral, Wang Shuin, and Mushroom Pizza. Tenshikaku is another card you'll almost exclusively see in stall decks, as it generates value the longer you prolong the game, which fits exactly into stall's plan. If you see Barbara or Kokomi, chances are you're against a stall deck. Not only do they provide healing, but being able to apply Hydro on your own characters allows you to cleanse elements, which can really slow down damage. So it's not surprising to see that the best example of this archetype is Ningguang Double Hydro, which not only runs both these characters, but combines this with Hydro Resonance and Crystallize to really put a stop to any damage. This deck is great at prolonging the game and uses that time to equip Ningguang with her talent, a weapon, and an artifact, and uses her to clean up the opposing team. And finally, we have combo decks. Their plan typically revolves around setting up one or more bursts as quickly as possible, and then using a combination of ramp and cost reduction, deal a lot of damage all in a single round. Combo decks are of course well known for their one-turn kill or OTK potential. Unlike Stall, these decks tend to be the least reactive, often more concerned with executing their own plan than counteracting whatever the opponent might be doing. Because these decks tend to be so burst-focused, energy generation cards are particularly good. Electro Resonance of course being the best example of this, but for decks that don't run 2 Electro, you'll also commonly see Li Xiu as a very efficient card at generating energy for your characters, among other options. Or if you see Minty Meat Rolls, the deck is most likely a combo deck. This card allows you to use 3 normal attacks in one round for a total of 7 dice, effectively generating 2 dice by itself, provided you're using normal attacks. And combo decks typically combine a repeatable burst effect with an infused normal attack to trigger repeated reactions for every single attack. So the more attacks you can do in one turn, the better. And because they rely on normal attacks so much, they can make use of cards that generate random dice much easier. Things like Parametric Transformer and Vanessa are perfect for combo decks. Kid Kujirai also fulfills a similar role, granting you that extra dice on the key combo turn. If your opponent doesn't survive the turn, they'll never get the ball. And finally, while Gamblers is used in pretty much every deck, this archetype is where the card shines the most. Combined with all the other dice generation effects, this can enable turns where you're using more than 16 dice worth of skills at once, easily overwhelming your opponent in a single round. While no longer as good as it was originally, Yoimiya Ayaka is a classic example of a combo deck. This deck is focused on rushing out Yoimiya's burst as quickly as possible, and then using Ayaka's built-in cryo infusion to repeatedly melt with every single attack, allowing you to kill opposing characters with just 2 attacks, and often discounted 2 with Minty Meat Rolls. Okay, by now some of you may be thinking, Professor, this is interesting, but just tell us which is the best archetype and we'll just all play that. Well, if only if it were that easy. Now, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but these 3 archetypes have a bit of a rock, paper, scissors relationship to each other, so there is no best. Aggro tends to be favored against combo as it's great at sniping off a key character that the combo deck needs, completely dismantling their game plan. In turn, combo decks tend to be favored against Stall, as Stall gains additional value with shield and healing over multiple turns, but because combo tends to deal its damage all at once, it can be a lot harder to deal with. Stall decks also don't pressure combo decks as well, so they can set up very easily without any danger. And at least in Genius Invocation, Stall does tend to be favored against aggro, mostly because there's so many good healing and shielding cards that exist that are very efficient at what they do. The ability to cleanse elements as well works extremely effectively at putting the brakes on aggro decks. And to complicate things just a little bit, these archetypes aren't mutually exclusive either. You can have decks that exist in between 2. For example, Itto decks could be considered Stall combo. They're looking to prolong the game, but then win in a single turn by sweeping the opposing side with Itto's burst. There are also decks in between aggro and Stall, which are sometimes called mid-range. Now, this might sound a bit contradictory, but the goal of these decks is generally to deal damage efficiently, but not necessarily quickly or focus just on the active character. Electrocharged and Superconduct are both reactions that fall perfectly into this category, as both are very damage efficient. Nahida Electrocharged in particular is a great example, especially when Oceanid's skill can sometimes have a defensive element when you summon the frog. And aggro combo decks are probably the rarest to find in Genius Invocation, but one example is the Bennett Electrocute deck. This deck can certainly threaten first turn kills with Electrocute's skill into an overload, but it also has the ability to rush out Bennett's burst and combine that with the rock, paper, scissors combo to deal massive damage in a single turn. And that's it for a quick overview on deck archetypes. Keep in mind that every deck is unique, and not every deck needs to cleanly fit into one of these 3 archetypes, but approaching decks in this way is a useful framework for understanding other people's deck lists, and also making sure that your own decks have a consistent game plan. In the end, nothing beats practice, so what are you waiting for, Traveler? Go and get dueling. For more advanced lessons, why not try one of my deck labs, where I do a deep dive on how to play a single deck. If there's anything you'd like to see in an upcoming video, drop a comment and I'll see how I can help. Be sure to enroll in our courses by subscribing so you can be notified when a new lesson's available. Until then, class dismissed!